Never again will she take away my freedom.
Hello and welcome to You Call That a Classic. I'm your host, Cece. National Banned Books Week is coming up. And although it's not here yet, I'd like to ease us into it by talking about something that, while not heavily banned, was at the very least somewhat controversial when it came out. In the 1980s, when this book was published, it was challenged or banned at 4 school libraries. 1 in Indiana, 1 in Florida, and 2 in Wisconsin. Yeah, I know. Wisconsin? As far as I know, their only exports are cheese, politeness, and hatred of people from Minnesota. And no, the author's not from Minnesota. So, what could be in this horrible book that, to quote one critic, glorifies Satan, suicide, and cannibalism, and also encourages children to be disobedient? Well, it's a book of poetry by Shel Silverstein. Yeah, I know. That Shel Silverstein. Seriously, what did he do to make Minnesotans angry? Anyway, Silverstein published 3 major anthologies of children's poetry, of which Light in the Attic is one of the more famous. I mean, there were only 3 of them. You could argue whether Where the Sidewalk Ends is more celebrated, but Light in the Attic is certainly up there. And I thought that, in honor of the upcoming week of festivities, we might look at a few of the more controversial poems in this horrible, soul-destroying attack on our nation's morals. Enjoy! If you have to dry the dishes, such an awful boring chore. If you have to dry the dishes instead of going to the store. If you have to dry the dishes and you drop one on the floor, maybe they won't let you dry the dishes anymore. This poem exemplifies a lot of what made Shel Silverstein popular. It's tight and punchy, it's got a very good meter, it's got a very simple, easy-to-follow rhyme scheme. It deliberately makes use of things like parentheses, dashes, abbreviations, and slang to make it sound like it's actually being spoken, which makes it a little more relatable and understandable. And because it's not as long as, say, Old Man Simon or Noise Day, it doesn't completely kill the joke in advance. You don't see the twist coming, and it actually comes across as a little subtle. Let's get to the criticism. This is one of the few poems that has been cited specifically as a problem, with a critic saying it, quote, encourages children to break dishes so they don't have to dry them, unquote. To that, I can only say, if you really believe that your, 6-year-old child is going to read a poem like this and uncritically decide to break dishes to get out of doing housework, I don't think the problem is with the poem. I met a ghost, but he didn't want my head. He only wanted to know the way to Denver. I met a devil, but he didn't want my soul. He only wanted to borrow my bike a while. I met a vampire, but he didn't want my blood. He only wanted 2 nickels for a dime. I keep meeting all the right people at all the wrong times. This is an odd one, particularly for a book like this. And no, I don't mean because of the content. As I mentioned, one of Silverstein's major selling points is his ability to structure his verses so that they sound almost like regular speech. His rhymes are often very creative, his meter is very fast-paced and inventive. It just carries kids along, which is good. But in this, he's managed to take it so far that he's completely dispensed with regular rhyme and meter, except for the last 2 lines, making this a free verse poem, which is not only unusual for the entire genre of, comedic poetry for children, but particularly unusual for Silverstein. He's not bad at rhyme, and, he's actually very creative with it. And his meter, as I said, is usually very good, which makes me think that, this is a deliberate choice. You could argue that he's trying to show that there exists a kind of structure at a lower level than those other things, because this is very clearly a structured piece. But you could also make the argument that he was just going for a particular tone and this was the way to do it. I can't really imagine this poem another way. And it really does stick out to me because I can remember it as a child. I can remember being a bit confused by it because I liked it. I enjoyed reading it. I probably had it memorized at some point. I memorized a lot of his poetry back in the day. But it didn't strike me as a poem. I thought of it as just a nicely written paragraph. But it didn't really feel like a normal paragraph either. I never really got used to the idea of free verse, but this was probably one of my first introductions to it. Anyway, more to the point, I'm pretty sure that this poem is where the accusation of Satanism came from, because if you search devil in a PDF copy of this book, it only comes up once, and it's here. There are other poems by Shel Silverstein about ghosts and witches and goblins and all the rest of it, and elsewhere in the book cannibalism, but this is one of the few that kind of implies it's a good thing, even jokingly. So, while you can kind of see where the, people's arguments came from, Satanism does seem like a bit of a stretch. It really reads as more of a play on classic fairy tale narratives than anything else. They've put a brassiere on a camel. She wasn't dressed proper, you know. They've put a brassiere on the camel, so that her humps wouldn't show. And they're making other respectable plans. They're even insisting that pigs should wear pants. They'll dress up the ducks if we give them the chance, since they've put a brassiere on a camel. They've put a brassiere on a camel. They claim she's more decent that way. They've put a brassiere on a camel. The camel had nothing to say. They squeezed her into it, I'll never know how. They say she looks much more respectable now. Lord knows what they've got in mind for the cow, since they've put a brassiere on a camel. I'd like to start by issuing a brief apology. Not for reading this poem, but for reading a version that had an obvious typo in it. I find it more convenient to go into web browsers and find sites that have the poems I read up on them so that I can just scroll through them pretty easily. For some reason, Word doesn't quite work that way for me. And I wanted the look to be consistent on all three of these poems, and I couldn't find a single site where all three of them were listed in the same format without at least one typo. Sorry about that. But to get to the poem itself, well, first of all, the structure is, again, pretty good. And the flow is good, the language is very straightforward, the rhyme scheme is clever and quick. But I never liked this poem, unlike the other two, even as a child, just personally. And the reason for that is that not that I was offended, and it's not that I didn't understand it. It's just, there are about 1.5 jokes in here. There's the one joke about, censorship and Bowdlerization, but he doesn't do anything with it. He just suggests other animals wearing clothes. That's it. There's no expansion there. I mean, the second to last line implies an expansion, but again, he doesn't really do anything with it. And the half joke is just the phrase brassiere on a camel, which, even if it is a little funny, gets old fast, even if you're a child. But with that said, my personal opinion on a poem's artistic merit should have absolutely no bearing on how it's received, and I don't really think that there's anything in here that would justify getting it banned. Of course, that's my opinion about everything, and you're welcome to take my opinion with a grain of salt. I'd also like to list a few other poems that I did not get to today that were also in Light in the Attic, but which I did not read aloud here because they're a bit longer. There's Kidnapped, Clarence, Ladies First, and Little Abigail and the Beautiful Pony. All 4 of those have been listed as possible reasons for the book's banning, particularly Ladies First and Little Abigail and the Beautiful Pony. So if you're interested in learning a little more about why this was banned, I would highly recommend looking them up. But in the meantime, all I can say is that Light in the Attic was a wonderful book. I still remember it fondly. It was a huge part of my childhood, and it will never cease to baffle me that things like that get banned. But this isn't National Banned Books Week, and we'll be coming up on that to see something that many people, not just the horrible, uptight right-wing prudes in Wisconsin, found objectionable. Until that time, I hope you've enjoyed this quick video. Feel free to like, comment, subscribe, and ciao!
Say revolting